We often mistake the loudest voice in the room for the most informed, assuming that absolute certainty equals profound competence. This instinctual trust and confidence is one of the most persistent illusions of our social lives, masking a deeper psychological reality. What if the very boldness we admire is actually a structural bypass for the difficult work of genuine, complex thought? Consider the last time you watched someone deliver an opinion with such unwavering force that you briefly questioned your own facts. They speak without the hesitation that usually accompanies deep analysis, projecting a reality that feels entirely solid and impressively unshakable. We are biologically wired to follow those who appear sure of their path, yet this evolutionary trait often leads us astray. The strange mystery is that the more someone knows about a subject, the more likely they are to express significant doubt. Conversely, those with the most superficial understanding often feel an intense, overwhelming sense of mastery over the topics they discuss. This gap between self-perception and actual ability creates a confusing social landscape where the incompetent are often the most highly promoted. It raises a haunting question about why our brains seem designed to reward the appearance of intelligence rather than the substance. Thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer noted that most people take the limits of their own field of vision for the limits of reality. He observed that a lack of intelligence is rarely experienced as a void. Instead, it feels like a completed, finished picture. This is the hidden psychological mechanism that philosophers and psychologists have termed a metacognitive deficit, a blind spot in the mind. It is the inability to recognize one's own ignorance, which in turn creates a vacuum that is quickly filled with unearned confidence. Carl Jung once suggested that thinking is difficult, which is why the majority of the human population prefers to judge instead. When we judge with certainty, we bypass the caloric and emotional cost of sustained, deep reflection and the agony of sustained uncertainty. This pattern is not a character flaw in the traditional sense, but a fundamental feature of how the human ego survives. By understanding this mechanism, we can begin to see why the world is frequently led by those who are least qualified. The core psychological mechanism behind this behavior begins with the way our minds handle information under pressure or during social interaction. Daniel Kahneman's research into cognitive systems reveals that we primarily operate on a fast system designed for rapid, intuitive responses. This fast system thrives on simple stories and immediate patterns, often ignoring the complex data that would require slow mental labor. For an individual with limited cognitive depth, the fast system is the only tool available, leading to conclusions that feel intuitively right. Because they cannot perceive the layers of nuance they are missing, they experience no internal friction to slow their confident delivery. Perception is filtered through a lens of ego protection, where the mind suppresses any information that might suggest a state of fallibility. Insecurity plays a silent role here. The ego overcompensates for a lack of depth by building a wall of assertive declarations. The brain naturally arrives at this pattern because certain social environments reward the signal of confidence over the noise of careful deliberation. Mental shortcuts, or heuristics, allow the mind to bridge the gap between what it knows and what it wishes to project. This creates a fluency bias, where the ease of making a statement is mistaken for the objective truth of the content. The individual becomes a victim of their own mental efficiency, mistaking their lack of confusion for an abundance of high-level expertise. Without the metacognitive ability to monitor their own thoughts, they cannot step outside themselves to see the errors in their logic. It is a closed loop of self-assurance where every thought is validated by the very mind that produced it, without external verification. This mechanism is essentially a defense against the existential anxiety of being wrong or appearing weak in a competitive social hierarchy. By remaining oblivious to their own limitations, the mind maintains a state of high morale, which translates into an attractive, bold presence. However, this presence is a hollow shell, constructed from the fragments of half-remembered facts and a desperate need for social validation. In modern behavior, we see this play out constantly in corporate boardrooms where the most assertive speakers often lack basic technical insight. They use professional buzzwords to create an aesthetic of intelligence, masking the fact that they have no grasp of the underlying principles. In the digital world, social media algorithms further reward this behavior by amplifying the most polarizing and certain voices over measured ones. We encounter the expert on every corner of the internet who explains complex global crises with the simplicity of a nursery rhyme. In romantic relationships, this manifests as a partner who is never wrong, turning every disagreement into a battle they must win. They don't see your perspective because their mind is physically incapable of holding two conflicting ideas at the same exact time. At social gatherings, The person who dominates the conversation is usually the one who has spent the least time reading the room. They mistake the silence of others for agreement, rather than the exhaustion of people who realize that arguing is a futile effort. In the political arena, we are frequently drawn to leaders who promise simple solutions to problems that are historically and structurally profound. Their confidence acts as a sedative for our own collective anxieties, making us willing to overlook their obvious lack of intellectual rigor. We find this pattern in the know-it-all friend who gives life advice despite having a personal life that is currently in total shambles. They are using the act of advising as a way to reassure themselves that they are still in control of their own reality. These examples are not isolated incidents but represent a consistent thread of human behavior that prioritizes the outward display of strength. The social cost of this behavior is high, as it leads to poor decision-making and a general degradation of public and private trust. Yet, we continue to be charmed by the charismatic incompetent because they offer us a sense of certainty that we deeply crave. There are even deeper hidden patterns that explain how this cycle of unearned confidence is reinforced and strengthened over the years. One such pattern is the confirmation bias, where the individual only notices information that supports their already established, overly confident worldview. If they believe they are brilliant, every minor success is seen as proof, while every failure is blamed on external, uncontrollable circumstances. Friedrich Nietzsche once noted that people will often cling to a conviction because it provides a sense of stable, unshakable orientation. For those lacking intellectual depth, changing a mind feels like losing a limb, as their identity is fused with their static opinions. Power also plays a role. As people gain social status, they often experience a decrease in empathy and a rise in self-assuredness. They begin to believe their own hype, losing the beginner's mind that is necessary for continued learning and authentic mental growth. Robert Greene describes this as the law of irrationality, where our emotions dictate our beliefs, which then dictate our distorted perceptions. Confidence is a social currency, and like any currency, it can be forged by those who have nothing in their bank. Emotional control is often misinterpreted as wisdom, but for the toxic confident, it is actually an emotional numbness to their errors. They lack the social shame that usually keeps people from making grand claims about subjects they do not truly understand or grasp. This interaction of factors creates a personality that is often wrong but never in doubt, a phrase used by many psychologists. Over time, this behavior hardens into a permanent personality trait, making the individual increasingly resistant to any form of constructive feedback. They surround themselves with yes-men who further insulate their ego from the harsh, cold winds of reality and objective truth. Knowledge is viewed by them as a fixed trophy they once won, rather than a living, breathing garden that requires constant weeding. They fail to realize that intelligence is primarily the ability to recognize patterns and adapt, rather than the ability to repeat slogans. Their perception of the world becomes increasingly narrow, focused only on the parts that allow them to feel superior to others. This narrowing of vision is a tragedy, as it cuts them off from the vast complexity and beauty of the actual world. Yet, they remain happy in their ignorance, protected by a biological shield that prevents them from seeing the cracks in their foundation. The brutal realization we must eventually come to is that this behavior is often a result of cognitive and emotional limitations. The people we perceive as arrogant or manipulative are often simply operating at the very peak of their mental and emotional capacity. They are not choosing to be shallow. They are simply unable to navigate the deeper waters of nuance and self-critical thought. The human mind is a master of self-deception, designed to protect the self from the crushing weight of its own inadequacies. If an individual were to suddenly see their own lack of intelligence, the resulting shame might be too great for them to process. Therefore, the brain continues to manufacture a sense of rightness as a way to keep the individual functioning in a harsh world. This doesn't excuse the harm they cause, but it shifts our perspective from one of hatred to one of clinical and philosophical pity. We are seeing a person whose defense mechanisms have become their entire personality, leaving no room for the authentic, vulnerable self. The ego is a survival organ, and in some, it has grown so large that it has consumed the host's ability to reason. They are limited by what they can perceive, and since they cannot perceive their own errors, they are effectively trapped in a loop. This realization allows us to stop taking their confidence personally and see it as the diagnostic marker of a hidden struggle. It is a reminder that we are all, to some degree, prisoners of our own biological hardware and the stories we tell ourselves. Now, we must turn the lens of this documentary toward ourselves, the viewers who are currently judging the unintelligent and confident. Every human mind, including yours, is susceptible to the same cognitive biases and ego-driven shortcuts described in these paragraphs. Do you have a subject where you feel absolutely certain, yet you haven't read a single book on the topic in years? Are you mistaking your own loud internal voice for the voice of objective reason and balanced, multifaceted, and fair truth? Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself to look within and find the places where he was being governed by vanity rather than reason. It is easy to point out the flaws in others, but far more difficult to feel the slight pull of our own self-protective delusions. Introspection is the only tool we have to break the cycle of unearned confidence and begin the slow work of genuine learning. Ask yourself if you are afraid of being wrong, and if that fear is what drives your most assertive and aggressive opinions. The mind is a mirror that often hides its own frame, leading us to believe we are seeing the world when we are only seeing ourselves. Recognizing our own vulnerability to these patterns is the first step toward a more honest and intellectually rigorous way of existing. The antidote to this trap of hollow confidence is the cultivation of a mindset rooted in curiosity, humility, and intellectual honesty. True intelligence is characterized by the ability to say "I don't know" and the willingness to be proven wrong by a better argument. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less, allowing the world to exist without your immediate judgment. When we prioritize curiosity over certainty, we open the door to a much richer and more accurate understanding of the people around us. Recognizing our limitations doesn't make us weak. It makes us resilient, as our confidence is built on the rock of reality. In the end, the most profound wisdom is found not in the absence of doubt, but in the courageous embrace of it. As we move through a world that demands we always have an answer, let us remember the value of the quiet, thoughtful pause. The most intelligent people are often the ones who are still listening, long after the confident have finished their shouting and their judging. What is one belief you hold today that you would be willing to let go of if you discovered it was based on an illusion?